The story of Pandora is a common myth heard among many civilizations and societies across the world, though with each culture it tends to change. Like the story of Adam and Eve, knowledge is often seen as a burden or a curse. Pandora's box is a cautionary tale that warns against the breaking of vows and the dangers that come from curiosity and the obtaining of forbidden knowledge. When Pandora was born, Zeus gifted her a gilded box. He told her that under no circumstance should any mortal be allowed to gaze into the contents. Every time Pandora saw the box, however, an urge to open it overcame her. She resisted the temptation for as long as she could until one day her curiosity overtook her willpower and she opened it. Evil spilled out of the box and into the world of mortals, whereas before this time, mortals knew nothing of good nor evil. With this knowledge, chaos would sow destruction across the land, but at the end, something else came out. Something glittering and golden. A radiant light spilled out. The light was hope, so while mortals would now know the desperation and terror of evil, they would also have the hope required to fight it. Carl Jung wrote that the psyche is broken up into two realms, the conscious realm and the unconscious realm. The unconscious realm consists of the personal unconscious, which is comprised of past experiential biases collected throughout life, and the collective unconscious, which is a collection of societal biases. Jung called those biases archetypes. For the most part, people live in the realm of the unconscious for the majority of their day. The unconscious consists of biases which inform instincts and allow us to function day to day without expending mental energy. Jung stated that to realize one's true self, one would have to confront the unconscious, and in doing so, confront the shadow self that lies inside of each of us. He implies that until the shadow is exposed to light, it will grow inside of us, blacker and denser. The shadow is not inherently evil. It is a collection of all the traits and proclivities we do not wish to admit we have. When we wonder why the neoliberal operates the way that they do, with a seeming disregard for human decency, we chalk it up to sociopathy. If Carl Jung is right, however, we may be seeing a shadow self that has grown so dark, so dense, that before it gives up the very thing that is killing it, they will collapse in on themselves like a black hole, dragging everything around it into the abyss. Human beings have a deeply ingrained habit of passivity, which is strengthened by the relatively long period that we spend under the control of parents and schoolmasters. That quote comes from a writer named Colin Wilson. The idea is that passivity is a learned behavior. It is learned throughout childhood when you are taught to eschew all wild ideas and thoughts. It is taught to you when you are told to sit down and be quiet. It becomes a habit when we start school and the novelty of life wears away and we come to realize that losing control over what we do from minute to minute will be our reality throughout the best years of our life. This passivity must be learned in order to function in society. To function in an office, you cannot have people running around singing songs and dancing in the halls between cubicles. Throughout our childhood and well into our adulthood, our intensity for life is stamped down upon by the show of society and ground into the dirt until we, like everyone else, learn the docile nature of polite society. Perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps to have a well-oiled and functioning society, some amount of passivity is required of the population. But what does this ingrained passivity cause in us? I believe that because of the nature of how we learn, we have come to depend on fast thinking or intuition. A teacher calls out your name out of the blue, and what's the answer? Learned intuition has you covered, as it always has an answer at the ready. Whether it be right or wrong, you're likely to say something. On the other hand, if your curiosity gets the best of you and you ask too many questions, you'll be told to sit down. You may be told that you're disturbing the class or derailing the teacher's well-laid-out learning plan. Education, oddly enough, is in many ways discouraging curiosity, at least here in the States. As a result, I believe we rely on our intuition much more often than we should for problem solving.
System 1 is essentially what comes up automatically in your memory. So, when I say 2 plus 2, something comes into your head. When I say your mother, an emotion comes. So all these things that are automatic, that's what I call System 1. And you have no control of it because it's automatic and involuntary.
Daniel Kahneman, the writer of Thinking Fast and Slow, defines lay intuition and expert intuition as System 1 processes, meaning they come from the fast thinking system. Yet one comes from a learned experience and expertise in a given subject, and the other comes from experience in tangentially related subjects or biases. If true that intuition is a lot like a habit in that the brain is working automatically from memories gathered over the years, if this intuition fails us, we learn a new lesson. If the intuition succeeds, we learn a different lesson. But this is an automatic system, and in order to go from lay intuition to expert intuition, we need to engage System 2, which is the slow thinking process. I come to this conclusion not because of something Kahneman said, but because of how he defines both systems. System 1 is fast, instinctive, and emotional, and System 2 is slower, deliberate, and logical. System 1, in order to learn how to adapt to unknowns, must receive feedback quickly and rapidly in order to learn, which is why we are able to learn control schemes so quickly if we're constantly exposed to problems that need to be overcome by using those mechanics. System 2, on the other hand, is only engaged when intuition is either incapable of solving the problem or curiosity is piqued by a complex problem. As an example, System 1 can solve 2 plus 2, but it cannot solve 24 times 17. In lab experiments, researchers noticed that the pupil of the test subject would dilate when System 2 is engaged. They noticed that when the test subject had to multiply 2 sets of numbers in their memory, the pupils would dilate slightly. 3 numbers would tax the patient, and their pupils would fully dilate, as well as their heart rate would increase. They noticed that when the subject had to hold 4 or more sets of numbers, the pupils would return to normal. They knew that this was a sign that the subject had given up on the task and that it was exhausting them. In these moments of intense concentration, test subjects suffer from what is called perceptual blindness. This blindness occurs when test subjects fail to see something that is obviously out of place in a scene simply because their attention was directed at a complex task. This is different from tunnel vision in that the vision area does not narrow, but instead, the brain does not register anything outside of what it is focusing on. So if System 2 is engaged and taxed, and the test subject is essentially blind when this happens, it would reason that it would probably be a bad idea to engage both at the same time if it's even possible to do so. Puzzles are often used to engage System 2. Take this example. You're running through a dungeon, and suddenly you come to a choke point where progress is halted by a puzzle you must solve. There are 12 items and 12 chests. Each chest has an engraved plaque on it. The player may try to intuit his or her way through the puzzle, but with this many possible combinations, the player will be there a while. They must engage System 2 to read the descriptions on each plaque and think through what certain words mean and how they relate to the items they are holding. But when they decide what item to put in the chest, it is usually intuition making that decision based on biases of past experiential feedback. This is why intuition is often wrong, but also why it's often right. If this puzzle had pictures instead of plaques, all the player would need to do is look at the images, and through pattern recognition, they can intuit their way through the puzzle, never engaging System 2 at all. If that is the case, it is very possible that the player could engage in other activities like combat while solving the puzzle at the same time. When System 1 is fully engaged and goes on uninterrupted, the player enters into a state that designers call flow. Flow is used to describe the feeling of meditative performance when someone is operating as if on autopilot, sleepwalking through a task at high efficiency and absolute accuracy. This flow state is only interrupted when the subconscious interrupts it to deal with the System 2 process, or the flow state is broken by a mistake.
Make sure that your games aren't too skill-based.
Right now, this is a screenshot of the top most played games on Congregate in the last 30 days, and 3 of those top 5 are idle games. It's so popular, you actually can watch Twitch streams of self-playing games. Like, the guy's not even playing this.
System 2, the slower thinking, is distinguished really by the fact that it's effortful and deliberate. What you can do deliberately, you do in System 2. And you can do, well, control yourself, control your thoughts, perform complicated computations. Those things are activities of System 2.
It would reason then if you wish to put your players into a flow state, the game must be relatively easy to play and have a control scheme that is familiar. When we are in a flow state, we are much more open to suggestion, so it would be important when influencing behavior that we stay away from engaging System 2, because when the subject is thinking rationally instead of instinctually, it is much more difficult to create new habits.
This is the fast thinking. I'm telling you that the fast thinking mode is what you want. The slow thinking is your analytical brain. What's 12 times 47? I'm sure all of you can answer that, but you have to start your actual thinking brain to do that. Now, if I say, complete the sentence, bread and everyone's thought, butter. Make stuff immediately useful, immediate gratification. Level-based game and you sell some boosters up front, for instance a coin doubler or some other stuff that will help you. People will have to analyze and think it through. These things are good for me, these will help me progress, before they do it. And they won't do that. If on the other hand you do, like for instance in this temple run, once your game is over, save me, I have a few seconds to spend hard currency and I get to continue.
When System 2 learns something, it is filed away as memory to be pulled out when needed. Facts, history, stories, subtext, and meaning, all of these things come from a slow and ponderous process of engagement with media of all types. The reason I bring this up is because System 1 has a much more important function than that of System 2. Things learned by System 1 eventually become habit when exposed to it time and time again. As I said before, System 1 learns through repetition. The more an action is repeated, the more myelin forms around that neurological connection. Think of white matter as a series of telephone wires transporting information. If the shielding around that connection is thin, interference is experienced. If the shielding is thick, however, the data can travel down the line without interruption. Essentially, this is how myelin works. This is why a learned behavioral process of System 1 is easy to do without thinking or effort. It also explains why a habit is hard to break.
A model for how people progress in a game. The hook is what gets you into the game to try out a free-to-play game. Then you build it into a habit that you play multiple sessions every day. Now, if we look at this from a monetization perspective, the hook is where you put up an icebreaker. You want to give a really, really good deal, something that's a no-brainer. You would be crazy to turn it down as a player. The reason to give a really good deal up front is by making people spend up front, they are also emotionally committing to your game, their retention will go up.
So the core loop of these games is you log in, you spend all your cash, and then you log out and you come back a few hours later and do it again. Now, that sounds kind of familiar. That's what we see in social games and in energy games, right? You get a certain amount of energy, you spend it all, and then you leave, and the energy comes back, and then you go do it again. And this ends up being a lot more palatable to players. It has a real-world analog. It makes sense, right? Like, you're not dealing with lightning bolts that are just kind of like added onto it. It's like, oh, I'm out of cash. I can't buy anything else. That makes sense to me, so I'm just going to come back later when I've got more cash.
In the book, The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg explains that habit, like addiction, is difficult to break because it is an automatic system that the addict is barely aware of. A person trying to quit smoking cigarettes, for example, may exhibit poor impulse control if cigarettes are around and available to them. To quit, the smoker must make a conscious decision to do so, and every time they are offered a cigarette, they must expend mental energy to resist. This mental energy is used to power the slow-thinking System 2 in order to break the cycle of habit exhibited by System 1. But in order to be tempted in the first place, the cigarette smoker must be confronted by a cue which kicks off the routine, and the smoker is rewarded by the rush of nicotine. These cues take on all forms, like an emotion, such as stress, frustration, or anxiety, or a pattern, such as going outside to talk to friends at work, or every time I do X, I get to smoke, or simply seeing someone smoke can be a trigger. Whatever the case may be, there are subtle, sometimes invisible triggers that give us the impulse to indulge in our routine. And because System 1 is so good at taking over for System 2, most of us don't even realize we're about to indulge in our habit until we've already done it.
You've often talked about is that people often make mistakes because they're in System 1, and even if they know, they can't help themselves.
You know, this isn't familiar to everybody from visual illusions, so the problem is with what we call cognitive illusions, the illusions in thinking, that it's never quite as clear-cut. You know, you really believe that you are wrong. With the visual illusion, you really believe that you are wrong. But with the cognitive illusions, it continues to feel right. So you have an error, somebody tells you it's an error. Your better self tells you it's an error, but it still feels right.
Picture System 1 and System 2 as two friends at a bar. A guy spills a drink on System 2, and before System 2 can think of a rational way to deal with this problem, System 1 is pushing System 2 back, saying, "I got this, bro," and before you know it, you're in a bar fight. To change a habit, you must engage System 2 and exert willpower. For years, it was thought that willpower was like a muscle, and if you worked it out, it would grow stronger. Studies have shown the opposite, actually, that the more willpower you exert over a short period of time, the harder it becomes to maintain it. Basically, You can run out of willpower if you drain a tank. However, small changes to a routine over time can affect real change, and those changes can have ripple effects with other, tangentially related habits. A famous experiment by Barg, Chen, and Burroughs studied the effects that certain words had on how we felt mentally and wondered if those feelings could manifest physically. The experiment consisted of 2 phases. The first phase consisted of a series of words that the students would be asked to arrange in a sentence. Some students were given words that were typically associated with the elderly, and others were given words that were associated with youth. The researchers then asked the participants to go outside and walk down a corridor to fill out a form in another room. They measured the walking speed coming into the first phase of the experiment against the walking speed after the experiment, and found that those who got the elderly words walked significantly slower than when they came in, and those that got youthful words walked significantly faster than when they came in. This is known as psychological priming. It is why certain words can make you feel a certain way, usually depending on the bias you have from System 1's fast-paced judgments. Another experiment used money and paper as a primer for emotions. The study forced half the participants to count pieces of paper with their dominant hand, while the other half counted a large stack of money. The researchers found that those that handled the paper were warm, caring, social, affable, and helpful, while those that handled money were the opposite. It has been suggested that money, like food, triggers a survival instinct, while others suggest that money is a trigger to feeling self-reliant and that one's own self-reliance is then projected onto the needy in their proximity.
Say the word folk 5 times. Folk, 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 folk. All right, spell it for me 2 times. F-O-L-K. What is the white part of an egg called?
Now, for this, you see those letters? S-H-A, you're gonna pronounce it. Sha. Yes. Now, T-W-A. Twa. T-W-I. Twi. T-W-U. Twa. T-W-E. Twe. T-W-O. Whoa.
Either way, we now have 3 core elements of habituality, or for a less gentle word, addiction: cues, behavior, and reward. If a person follows this loop of behavior will become a habit, and over time, that habit will be engaged in before the conscious mind is even aware of it. If we were to disregard the dubious ethics of taking advantage of those mental weaknesses, we would willingly be giving mass to the shadow. To understand why it's so hard to reverse course for an industry, we should look at some numbers. Activision reported in 2018 that revenue from digital online channels, which included things like subscriptions, downloadable content, microtransactions, and digital copies of games, topped $5.7 billion. In a further breakdown, $2 billion of that revenue came from King, which creates mostly free-to-play titles featuring microtransactions heavily. This is important information to know if you were to make an argument that a company or sector or industry must move away from certain predatory practices, as the money that would be lost in doing so must be made up in some other way, or the stock could potentially lose billions in value, which would result in massive layoffs and a depression in the market. Also, when a business plan is successful, there is very little motivation to change. Many have suggested that increasing the price of games may reduce the need for supplementary income from microtransactions. Some have suggested a simple $10 increase to the price of games. However, when you look at the billion-dollar profits of microtransactions, it is still in the best interest of game studios to sell a game at a loss if it will generate billions in post-purchase transactions. Even if it was enough to stem the inclusion of loot boxes and microtransactions, the public has shown that it doesn't want higher prices. The public actively rages against any hint that games will become more expensive. If we were to follow the rate of inflation, a game that cost $49.99 in 1980 would cost roughly $155 today. That price would also be a huge barrier for entry to many people and would sell a fraction of the copies that it would sell at a $60 price point. Research indicates that even a price increase of $10 would decrease sales dramatically, and no studio wants to be the first to increase their prices. For an analogy, let's look at the newspaper industry for a good example of what happens when you open the box and how once it is opened, you can never shut it. When newspapers first started struggling with sales, they made a bargain with the devil. They sold advertising space. And in time, the newspapers came to rely on that revenue to stay afloat, as the public was unwilling to pay more for printed news. Now, for a moment, let's forget what being beholden for a living by the corporations you may be investigating can do to journalistic integrity. Let's focus on instead what an infection can do once it enters the bloodstream. In time, as they tried to compete with the speed of television and then later the speed of the internet, newspapers sold more and more advertising until it was mostly ads. In time, thanks to a psychological phenomena called banner blindness, people were able to ignore the ads, so the marketing departments had to come up with new tricks, hence native advertising. Now it is hard to tell what is an ad and what is actual news. It is also becoming harder to trust what is printed, and newspapers are becoming a shadow of themselves, but at this point, can they turn back from the left-handed path they've taken? Like the story of Pandora. Once you open the box, you cannot put the devil back in.